everyone. I'm Richard Herskowitz, director of the Ashland Independent Film Festival. And this is our first talkback around the theme of activism, which is the central theme of our festival this year. I just want to say that the centerpiece of this activism theme is a tribute to Skylight Media that we're doing, and the full Resistance Saga that we're doing is the US premiere here this weekend. So Pamela Yates, and who also here, Paco Donis, could you raise your hand? Oh, right over here. Just so you know, they've been through many treacherous situations, I guess, in the hills of Guatemala with the insurgents, but yesterday getting through the weather across the country, probably, they got in like 1 in the morning, several planes late, so thank you for all you went through to get here.
Thank you for inviting us. Really.
But anyway, yesterday was a rough day. It was a great day for the festival. I hope you were here to see Dolores Huerta last night, come to the theater. But it wasn't a glorious day weather-wise, so we have lost several people. So Nanfu Wang's flight got canceled, and so she's not able to be here. And Sonya Childress, our moderator, wasn't able to come except by Skype. So Sonya, thank you for doing this. Let me just see. Now also, we are waiting for Peter Bratt. There is a call in to him. Hopefully he will make it. Let me see, one other thing to mention. I'll try to stop after this one, and that'll be the last problem. But there are a couple of mistakes that in the handout. You'll hear about who's representing whose streets. You'll hear about Lucas soon. So at this stage, I just want to mention that these two filmmakers up here are not the only filmmakers, and Peter, who have films about activism in our program. We also have Jenny Olson here, and Jenny Olson is the winner of our Pride Prize this year.
Jenny.
And she is much... And Jenny may end up coming up here and joining us if we have a seat or two to fill out. And she's the producer of the film Freedom to Marry, about the two lawyers who were so instrumental. Oh, here he is. Hey, Peter. All right. Okay. So, let me just tell you, we are going to attempt, I'm here to possibly fill in if we have any technical glitches as moderator, but I am so grateful to Sonya for coming in by Skype. Let me tell you about her. She serves as the Director of Partnerships and Engagement for Firelight Media. Firelight Media being the great production company and educational organization started by Stanley Nelson, the director, and Marcia Smith. She has positioned film as a tool to shift narratives and support social justice movement building for over 15 years. Before Firelight, she held staff and consulting positions with California Newsreel, Active Voice, Cartemequin Films, which was the company we honored last year, Working Films, and the Independent Television Service. She led the impact campaigns for the Black Panthers, Freedom Summer, Freedom Riders, and Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, and she contributed to numerous other films. She's a frequent speaker, funding panelist, and was an inaugural 2015 Rockwood Just Films Fellow, serves on many boards, and resides in Los Angeles. So now I will turn things over to Sonya Childress.
Thank you, Richard. Can you all hear me? Yes. Great. I can hear you all. I can see the panelists really well, and I see some bodies over there on the left. I hope it's a full room because I'm really excited about this conversation today. This is a subject matter that's really close to my heart. Lucas, Pam, Peter, you guys can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great, awesome. Well, I'm, enormously sad that I couldn't be there in person. I have a little sick boy, but I am, I've been thinking a lot about this panel for a long time, and it's a real honor to be in conversation with the three of you and all the folks in the room. This is obviously a really timely conversation. Narratives that lift up social justice movements are needed more than ever. Narratives that inspire and engage and mobilize people to see leadership in themselves are needed more than ever. So this conversation couldn't come at a better time, and you all are really great representatives to help lead this conversation and help us all think about both the responsibility of filmmakers and storytellers, but responsibility also of audiences in how we use these films. So I just want to say a little bit about sort of my thinking about some of these issues. As Richard mentioned, for the last decade, I've been leading impact campaigns for Stanley Nelson's films. He's a veteran doc filmmaker who looks particularly at civil rights movement, makes historical docs and that center the African American history and experience in this country. And my role has been to lead impact campaigns and audience engagement strategies around those stories. And part of my role has been to engage the protagonists, the organizers in the impact campaign. And these folks are the architects and the foot soldiers of the Freedom Rides, Freedom Summer, Black Panther Party. These are experts in organizing. And you can't organize an organizer. It's hard enough to corral an organizer. You can't out-organize an organizer. And that's been my challenge for the last 10 years, is to leverage the brilliance of these brilliant minds to lift up these narratives. And I've learned that these films have enormous power, both in re-energizing and re-energizing people who were active when these movements occurred, to energize young people who see themselves in these stories, who become inspired by these stories and see activism in themselves. It helps to change the narrative around dissent and activism. And these films have these are incredibly powerful tools when used properly. But films about movement and movement leaders also present really interesting and unique challenges to filmmakers and to people leading impact campaigns. And the questions that come up for us internally as a production company and media organization is, what is the responsibility of the filmmaker to the social movement that they're documenting? And what's an appropriate role for those organizers in the framing of that story, the shape of that story, and how that story is deployed? So I think those are the questions that we want to I hope will guide us in this conversation. And I'm going to introduce all the panelists. We'll talk to each filmmaker, and then we'll open the conversation up to the audience. How's it sound?
That's good, Sonya.
Hope it's not too loud here in the background. Is it a little loud in the background? City life. So I'm gonna start first with you, Peter. I'm gonna give you a quick bio and we'll start with you if that's okay?
Yeah.
Great. So Peter Bratt is an acclaimed independent filmmaker and screenwriter whose first motion picture, Follow Me Home, won the Best Feature Film Audience Award at the 1996 San Francisco International Film Festival. The film, which Bratt wrote, directed, and produced, also earned him the Best Director Award at the 1996 American Indian Film Festival and was an official selection in competition at the Sundance Film Festival. Peter's the recipient of numerous honors, including a Rockefeller Foundation Film Video Multimedia Fellowship, the prestigious Norman Lear Writers Award, as well as a Stella Award, an honor bestowed by the National Association of Latino Independent Producers to filmmakers whose achievements reveal leadership, creativity, and tenacity, as well as vision and passion for their craft. Peter's most recent film, which he's bringing here to the festival, is Dolores, documentary, as you all know, about the Chicana civil rights leader. which premiered at Sundance, will have a theatrical release and PBS broadcast, I believe, next year. So, Peter, thank you for joining us today.
Right, good to be here. Say what's up to Stanley, too. Say what's up to Stanley. He and I were the Film Forward. We launched the Film Forward initiative launched by Sundance. I had La Mission and Stanley had the Freedom Riders. So we actually met in New York.
Oh, awesome. I will tell him.
And I think my brother Benjamin narrated his film on Wounded Knee, too.
I know.
Small
I'm really
world.
excited about that. He's texting me now, so I can text him back. And
Stanley, by the way, if you don't know, he got the Genius Award. He's just a phenomenal, prolific documentary filmmaker, and the guy's amazing, truly.
So I should say, Peter, he saw your film at Sundance, and he has been raving about it. He's a stickler, and Stanley raves about very few films. I will have to say, after 10 years of working with him, he loves Dolores. So he's really excited that I'm helping with this conversation today.
Great.
So as for many of us in social justice circles, Dolores Huerta is a legend. She's a living legend. Yet her role in the farm worker movement was consistently under-recognized and undervalued. And I think in many ways your film does a huge service in correcting that narrative and in that history. So just tell us a little bit about what compelled you to tell her story, and what did you hope to say about her legacy while she's alive and with us?
I have to first say that I was raised by a single mother who was also a movement leader. My mother was one of the natives who occupied Alcatraz in 1969. She was also in the Wounded Knee occupation in '73, and marched with the farm workers in and around the Bay Area. So I grew up very aware of Dolores and Cesar, and I was a kid marching and protesting, not knowing really what I was protesting, but it was I was just kind of inculcated in the culture. So I was aware of her, and then I met her. She came to the LA premiere of my first film, Follow Me Home, and then I began my own relationship with her as an adult, and I knew her importance within the Chicano civil rights movement. And I mean, I'm college educated. I thought I was well aware, but it wasn't until I dove into the research about the film that I realized how much I didn't know about her involvement in the movement. And I had let me backtrack a little bit. I had my second feature, La Mission, came out in 2008, and at that time in Arizona they had just passed SB 1070, which allowed police officers to pull over someone they suspected of being undocumented. So they were pulling over brown people left and right. And so there was a national boycott called by Latino organizers and activists and artists to asking all artists, all businesses to not do business in Arizona. So our film was opening in Arizona, which was the distributor's biggest market. And my brother Benjamin and I, we didn't want to cross the picket line. And yet all this money and time and outreach had been invested, and we didn't know what to do. So I called Dolores. And I said, damn, Dolores, what are we going to do? And Dolores says, you're going to take the film to Arizona, and you're going to show it in the barrios and in our communities, because we need to hear our stories and see ourselves on screen. And in fact, I'm going with you. So Dolores came with us opening weekend on her own dime, on her own time. She drove down, she did Q&As with us, she did press with us, she introduced us to community leaders and Congress people, and people mobilized and came out in full force to support the film. And as I watched her kind of work the room, she took over the Q&A. She took over the Q&A. I marveled at her, and I had the thought, like, oh my God, man, someone should do a movie on her. Maybe Stanley Nelson will do something on it, And then fast forward a few years later, Brother Carlos Santana, he called up and he said, we have to do a film about La Reina Dolores while she's still with us. And I told Carlos, you know, I'm not a documentary filmmaker, come from feature. And he said, well, you got to do it. So we started to have a conversation, and we brought Dolores into the conversation. And then for me, as a storyteller, even though I grew up with this reverence and respect for Dolores, I told her that I would need, as a storyteller, to kind of dive into her personal life, because I feel like if you're going to tell a story about a hero or heroine, you need to reveal the human being and kind of peel back the layers so people can relate to that person. And in the Latino community, Dolores is just, you know, she's like, you bow down. And so I didn't want it to be like a puff piece. And that was a real challenge with Dolores. I mean, I felt like I had an ethical responsibility to have her blessing and her family's blessing. She has 11 children. We interviewed all of her children but one. And also I felt an incredible responsibility to the overall movement, the Chicano movement, the farm worker movement, because I was a part of it. And I knew that narrative had not been told. So I felt a great responsibility, and I said, Dolores, the only way I'm going to go forward is with your blessing. But you know, we have to peel back the layers, and I want to interview your children, and you know, I want the difficult stories, the difficult struggles. And she was, I think she really was resistant to that, to tell you the truth. She really wanted the film to be about organizing and about the movement and about the struggle. And I said, those elements will be woven into the narrative, but the audience is going to journey with you, you know. So I felt, you know, that was a struggle throughout the process, and it was a struggle up until she saw the film with an audience. And you said something that made me laugh. You can't organize an organizer, but we were going head to head. And after she came and she saw the screening at Sundance, and she started seeing how audiences were getting her message of everyone has power. It doesn't matter who you are or what your background, everybody has power. And when you bring your power with other people, you can create change. And then also that change requires some kind of sacrifice. And that also, you know, change also is, you know, voting and voter registration is a huge part of social action and transformation. So she started seeing how people were getting this from her individual personal story. And so she came up to me actually at Sundance and she says, you know what? You out-organized me, dude. So.
High praise.
Yeah, man, you know what, that's the highest praise. So, you know, since then the film has inspired people to re-engage, and we had a test screening in San Francisco, and I had invited some organizer friends of mine from the African American, Latino communities, and people. This was like at the height of the Black Lives Movement, and people were just so burnt out and disillusioned, and Dolores had supported Hillary in the primary, and a lot of these folks were Bernie Sanders supporters. So there was a little bit of Dolores hate at the time that we were doing these rough cut screenings. And there was one brother in particular, he just was like, you know, I respect the Dolores of the past, but I do not respect the Dolores of the present, and you know, I'm gonna give up on organizing, I'm just gonna focus on my family. He came and saw the rough cut, and he stood up in tears, and he just said,
yeah.
I gotta rethink this. Look at this woman. I'm rebooted. I'm gonna re-enroll. I'm all in, and you know, he's organizing to this day. He's coming to the San Francisco premiere we're having Sunday, and he wants to give Dolores a hug and thank her. So
That's a beautiful story.
yeah, so that's how it's kind of been going, and we know Dolores's primary interest now with the film is she wants to use the film, of course, as an organizing tool. So we open in September theatrically, and we're going to go to communities and reservations where these kinds of narratives usually don't reach, and she wants to organize people. You know, she's 87, man, and she does not, like Barack Obama says in the movie, she does not play. Dolores is fearless and tireless, and we have a hard time keeping up with her, but I want to say to all my elders, you know, there's no tapping out, man. And Dolores has kind of brought that to fore. So I'll close with that.
Thank you. I have another question for you, Peter, before we go to Pamela. And you know, sometimes when filmmakers are making films focused on a particular movement leader who they admire, naturally there's a desire to give them the treatment that you feel they deserve. Give their organizing, their brilliance, their commitment, the filmic treatment that they deserve. And in doing so, and to the movement that the movement deserves as well, giving it the narrative that it deserves and needs. And in doing so, there may be some pressure internally to lose a bit of the complexity about that particular person, right? You know where I'm going with this, right? And I think your film does a huge service by adding so much nuance and complexity to her as a leader, as a woman, and really showing how she, the personal sacrifices that she and her children made to be the leader that we all admire. And not every filmmaker is able to do that with the ease and the skill that you did. And I think that's a real, a real gift that you
I would take out the word ease.
But boy, you made it look easy. So how did you balance that desire to create the narrative that you hope to create and tell a story about who she is as a very complex woman?
Right. I mean, I'm a great believer that a story has personhood. It has a spirit that you get to know throughout the process. And so I always take direction and guidance from that energy. So I may have my own agenda as a storyteller, and I want a certain style, but ultimately you try to force something in a hole and it doesn't work, and because the story wants what the story wants. So for us, I researched her work for about a year before I even started thinking about the narrative. And what became apparent is that she was deliberately marginalized, both, I want to say, within the Latino community, the organizing community, as well as the dominant culture. So to me, that became part of the narrative string. And then when we started doing the archival research, there was just this abundance of existing material of her in action. So I felt like rather than have a VO narrator or somebody kind of dictating where the narrative's going, we wanted to let the archival material kind of tell the story itself. So there's no VO, there's no narrator. It's just interviews intercut with archival footage. So you actually see Dolores in action through 7 decades, and you kind of get the breadth and depth of her work. And then for me, again, it was really difficult to get Dolores to go along with wanting to share her personal life and struggle, her relationship with Richard, her children, motherhood. I think that was really difficult for her. But when I'm in the director's chair, I'm really listening to that person, that story, that spirit, and that gives me a strength to even resist Dolores Huerta when she. And I think you have to hold firm in that as a director. So. And then the other thing is, and this is what's really different from narrative filmmaking, is what was really intimidating to me was, going forward, and Carlos is investing this money, and I did this year of research, and I'm like, oh shit, I don't really know what to frame the story around. I'm trying to discover it, and then it was in about a quarter through the process where Dolores shared with me, not in an interview, but just have over lunch, that she was a professional dancer. and that, you know, she did flamenco and salsa and ballroom, and she had plans to be a professional flamenco dancer, but got hooked into organizing instead. So I started asking people in the interviews about Dolores being a dancer, and you know, she can close down any party, and she's the last one on the dance floor, and Angela Davis seemed to know about it, and everybody seemed to know about Dolores the dancer. So for me, that became my way into the story. And then she also shared with me that she's never been intimidated or scared to meet or speak to anyone, be it Reagan, be it RFK, be it Hillary Clinton, Obama. She said the one person that rendered her silent was Bird, Charlie Parker. And that she was a jazz aficionado. She used to go up to the Fillmore. And so the music and dance and jazz became kind of this way into the film, and then we followed suit. But the archival was going to tell the story in the interviews.
All right, thank you. Pamela, we're going to go to you. Pamela Yates is co-founder, as you all know, of Skylight Pictures. She's currently the creative director at Skylight, which is a company dedicated to creating feature-length documentary films and digital media tools that advance awareness of human rights and the quest for justice by implementing multi-year outreach campaigns designed to engage, educate, and activate social change. Her 2011 film was Granito, How to Nail a Dictator, for which she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. The film was used as a key forensic evidence in the Rios Montt genocide conviction in Guatemala. She is a member of the Academy of Motion Pictures of Arts and Sciences, Writers Guild, IDA, and a contributing editor of NACLA, the Report on the Americas. Pam's latest film, 500 Years, which is here at the festival, is the third in the Guatemalan trilogy that explores the battle for the national narrative in present-day Guatemala. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you so much, Sonya.
So unlike Dolores and Hooligan Sparrow, which is Nan Fu Wang's film that we were going to talk about today, 500 Years is less a story about the sort of big man in history, one individual activist, and more around this groundswell of a popular uprising against a corrupt government. But that said, you do look at two women who are active as organizers and journalists, and they do their work in an environment where their vocal opposition to the government could lead to their imprisonment or worse. So the stakes are very high in the telling of this particular story for your protagonists. So I want to talk a bit with you, Pamela, about your experience both working in this region, documenting organizers who are in an environment where where their safety is a concern as a filmmaker, and thinking about when you are telling these stories where the political events are unfolding. These folks are actors in the shaping of that particular government. Are you thinking as a filmmaker that your role and that in telling these stories and putting these stories out is to provide the sort of international exposure that could provide cover for some of your protagonists? What are you hoping that these films can do as they're seen in North America?
Well, my style of filmmaking has always been highly, highly collaborative. So 500 Years was the third film in the Guatemala trilogy that began in 1982 with When the Mountains Tremble. And in 1982, in When the Mountains Tremble, I had spent 6 months in Guatemala filming scenes during the Civil War there. But it was my first feature-length documentary film, and I didn't, filming in a war is hard enough, but filming in a war and trying to tell a story is super difficult. And I didn't really have a thread to tie the story together. And while we were editing back in our studio in New York, someone who knew we were working on the film brought a young Guatemalan woman. She was 22 years old, Mayan, living in exile. And her name was Rigoberta Menchú. And she came into our studio and she looked at all the material and the scenes that we had cut together. And she wrote her part of the story based on the material we had already filmed. And then we went into a studio with her and she spoke directly to the camera and we intercut those scenes. And so not only was that like a really seminal experience in how this film became so much better because of that collaboration, But then Brigitte and I traveled around the world, and the film helped give her a stage. It actually helped put her on the world stage. And for the next 10 years, she worked tirelessly for peace, and she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. The first indigenous person to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's also showed me how that collaboration, not only in the making of the film, but in the taking of the film out into the world, coupled with a movement, because at that time there was a very strong movement for Central American solidarity, could both elevate the people in the film, and the people are helping elevate the film so you get the maximum exposure possible. Okay, so fast forward to the third film in the Guatemala trilogy, 500 Years. You know, it's really a Mayan concept of collectivity, very deeply ingrained. And in 500 Years, there are actually 5 protagonists. And I met all of them when I went to film the Rios Montt genocide trial in Guatemala in 2013. I was there to document the trial from gavel to gavel. I didn't know it was the beginning of the third film in the trilogy. And the idea was to, every few days, to put some of the trial up on the web, to throw the doors of the courtroom open to the entire world. This was the first trial for genocide against indigenous people in the Americas ever. And there's been a lot of genocides. So it was really important, I thought, to document it and to let as many people know what the highlights were. And that's where I met all the people. I knew that the genocide trial, when it was completed and the conviction was handed down, I knew that it was a tipping point in Guatemalan history and in world history and in indigenous history. But what were the effects of that going to be? And how were we going to feel it out in the world? And that became the inspiration for the new film, 500 Years. The people that I met and I started to film with, I thought it was going to be more about how the trial affected the psyche and the organizing ideas and strategies. But actually, the effects of the trial became much more than that. It galvanized a national movement. It galvanized an alliance between indigenous people who were already well organized in the highlands and Latinos, or non-indigenous people in the city, who were just beginning to come out and become politically active. But the indigenous movements actually had a lot to teach them. So they took to the streets in hundreds of thousands. And I like to say the Guatemalan people really wrote the third act of that film. I think in all the films, Sonya, we're trying to tease out what are the universal values? What is happening in Guatemala? What about this small country in Central America that was able to put together an incredible case for genocide against a perpetrator, a powerful general, and dominate? What do we have to learn from the wisdom of the Mayans? What are the strategies? We're calling the release of the 3 films, the release of the 2 former films in 500 Years, the Resistance Saga. Because what is it we can learn about resistance? What can we learn from 500 years of resistance? What are the strategies? What are the tactics? What are successful? What does resistance mean? It means how you respond when you're under constant attack, and how you continue to stay encouraged, and how you continue to inspire other people. And that's what I thought 500 Years could tell a North American audience. I really did. Now, I think at the same time, you have to have a strategy of how are you going to open the film in Guatemala? How are you going to open the film with the people who helped make the film? And while we were at Sundance, and 5 of the women in the film actually came to Sundance, which was great. And Andrea Ixchiu is here also. She's not right here, but she's here in Ashland, so you'll see her at the screening of the films. They wanted to open the film internationally first. They felt that if it got reviews and acclaim and audience consideration abroad, that it would help protect him from the ultra-right in Guatemala. And so we decided to pursue that strategy and then open the film in the places where it was filmed and then descend into the capital to do a big opening there. It's always really difficult working with people in an incredibly unsafe environment. People often ask me at Q&As, like, was I afraid? Was it scary? I mean, compared to the Guatemalans, my fear is little. They're really putting everything at risk. They live in Guatemala, they travel internationally, but they still have to come back and continue to resist. So I'm always very cognizant that that's happening. And I let them lead the way and show me what is going to be secure and not secure for them.
Pamela, your approach is really collaborative, and that's unique. As you know, not every filmmaker operates in that way, regardless of the film subject, but particularly when the film subject is an organizer. Talk a little bit more about this, how you navigate the power dynamic between filmmaker and protagonist, particularly when there are differences in nationality, differences in education level, differences in economic level, and when there's differences in safety, your ability to come in and out of an unsafe place, and the reality that they live in that is consistently unsafe for them. How do you navigate that dynamic, and what kinds of conversations do you have with the protagonists of the film that lift up make that dynamic plain?
Well, it really starts from building the relationship of trust, mostly before the cameras even roll. And talking about the film and talking about the ideas. With 500 years, I had a distinct advantage because I had made 2 other films in Guatemala. So in some ways, it was like having an all-access pass at a rock concert. But still,
a dangerous rock concert.
Yeah. No, but still, I think we start from the position of equality, and that nothing is off the table to talk about. I'm trying to help them tell their story, but sometimes parts of that story can't be told, or what I try to do is I try to encourage people to let us film every part of the story. And then I encourage them to come see cuts of the film. And actually, in coming to see the cuts of the film and talking about it, I learned so much. There are many things that I could not have seen without their help. I think the other thing is that I assure them that I want to go out into the world with them, with the film, that they're going to be part of that, if not leading that effort. In this case, in Guatemala, they're going to be leading the effort. But also, we try to create a media ecosystem around each feature-length film. So that means we create shorts, microdocs, digital, companion digital pieces. When you make a film, if it's a good film, it engenders so much emotion afterwards. What are you going to do with that emotion? Where are you going to go with that emotion? How are you going to harness that emotion? And you can only harness it if you have a team of people who are going to work to organize that emotion and point it in the right direction. Have it be a force for positive social change. And I think that's really the essence of collaboration. Hey, we all have a role to play. That's what granito means. It means tiny grain of sand. We each have to figure out what is our tiny grain of sand to contribute to positive social change. And it's not going to be the same granito de arena. But if I live in the United States and I'm able to raise money to make an epic documentary film about an epic movement, I'm going to do that. And I think having people be part of the process from the inception of the idea through the outreach and impact is crucial to that.
Yeah, that's great. I commend you in that process, because I know it's not easy, but you all do it so well.
I just want to say one other thing too, Sonya,
yeah,
which
please.
is that money, right? Sustainability. We have to be sustainable, but also the subjects in our film, they have to have a way of making a living. While we're making the film, you have to be raising money for your outreach and impact. And that money's got to include the activists in the film, giving them an honorarium, giving them a stipend. They're traveling with the film. They're doing an amazing job. I mean, they bring so much richness to the film showings because, I always think that you make a successful film if people are more interested in talking to the people in the film than talking to you. And that's really true. They're really interested in talking to the people, and
yeah, I would agree. You know, as the field of impact is extending the life of these documentary films and putting filmmakers and the protagonists on the road for 6, 8, 12, 24 months at a time, that's a huge gift to audiences that are able to engage both with the media and the storyteller and the protagonist in that film. It's also huge. It can be very tough for the protagonists, for the subjects, to take off work, to re-experience traumatic events on film over and over again, which sometimes are, open up old wounds, and then they have to turn around and talk to audiences immediately after. The field of impact is really changing the way in which subjects of documentary films engage with their story and engage with audiences. And I think the documentary field has a lot of learning to do very quickly about how to involve subjects, which is a shitty term, sorry everyone for the language, but it's a crappy term for folks who share their stories with us on film. How we engage them respectfully and ethically, and that means financial compensation, that means preparing them for the experience. There's a lot that we need to learn to do better. And I think you've done a lot of that learning, and your experience is really useful, I think, to the field. I have one more question for you, Pamela, before we go to Lucas, which is, when you ask activists who are in these films, what story they'd like to tell, and Peter, you kind of mentioned that with Dolores, they'll always say, don't make it about me, make it about the movement. Help people learn the mechanics of organizing, help people understand the strategy that went, that it took to get that gain, to get that win. They're thinking movement, strategy, use this as a tool, right? Funders are asking you to make character-driven films that engage people emotionally and make it about that one person or two people. Movement is too amorphous. We want a really good story that has a beginning, middle, and an end and makes us feel good at the end of it. And sometimes audiences also need a character to get pulled into this larger idea. So how do you, Pam, navigate those sometimes competing expectations for how you tell a story about organizing?
Character driven, it's one of those phrases like B-roll. I just, I can't deal with it. I like to have an ensemble cast, actually. Some people are throughout the whole film, and some people have a really important role to play in one act. But they all are part of the story, because you're really telling, political and personal stories and interweaving it with the political ideas across the spectrum, across the arc of the storytelling. To me, that's the art of nonfiction filmmaking, how you actually do that. And so I really eschew this idea that the only way to tell a story is character driven. I think there's so many ways to tell nonfiction stories. Time, Sonya, time is everything. It's kind of the beauty and the horror of being an independent nonfiction filmmaker, because we have a lot of time, and the story begins before we start our film, and the story continues after we end our film. So when do we begin and when do we end? And in all of that, there is the time spent with, I call people in the film protagonists, actually, because they're the drivers of the story, and they're the drivers of history, and they're the drivers of activism. 90% of the time that we're together, we're not filming. We're talking, we're eating, we're preparing meals together. We're going, hey, Andrea Ixchiu, Hernandez, she's right here. Stand up, stand up. Protagonist. And that's when we get to know each other, and that's when all of the other really good things that you are talking about come out, because it's time plus trust, I think, plus artistry that is going to get us to where we're going.
Great. Thank you, Pam. So let's go to you, Lucas. Lucas Farrar is a filmmaker and photographer based in New York City. Hey, what's up, Lucas? How you doing? Lucas is director of photography for Whose Streets, and if you saw it, or if you're going to see it, you'll see that the camera work is really beautiful. He did an amazing job. Whose Streets is a first-hand look at how the murder of one teenager became the last straw for community under siege. Whose Streets is a story of love, loss, conflict, and ambition. The story of everyday people turned freedom fighters whose lives intertwined with a burgeoning national movement for Black liberation. Whose Streets premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and will have a theatrical release later on this year. Let's welcome Lucas. So, hey, Lucas, so the uprising in Ferguson and the movement for Black lives that evolved as a result is, or had evolved prior to, in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin's murder. Obviously, this movement is fresh in the minds of North American audiences, right? This is a contemporary movement that folks are familiar with. And in an effort to frame those events and tell that story, the mainstream media both vilified the people in the streets who are leading this movement, and also at the same time sought to find one or two people who could be the leader who spoke for that movement, right? And Whose Streets in every way challenges that frame and challenges that approach to telling the story of this unfolding movement. Whose Streets gives space to people who are on the front lines to tell their own story and to put their humanity rather than simple actions and make that the forefront. And that's what Whose Streets does really well, and that's what I think what the people of Ferguson really wanted from a film. So like 500 Years, this film is not about one person, but it's really about a popular uprising. So with so much media, negative media attention on the folks of Ferguson, I imagine there was a great concern among people on the ground around what story you all would tell. And I'm sure they were really hesitant, even though I know you all were there, to open up. And once they opened up, they may have been even more hesitant about what you're going to do with what they said on camera. So talk about some of the concerns that were expressed from the folks who you covered in the film, who you documented, and how much did those concerns enter into your minds as you were in the edit room and shaping the story?
Thanks so much, Sonya. As you can tell, I'm probably the newbie on the block out of this panel. But yeah, to dive into that, I think you can see that very clearly in both Dolores and 500 Years, the fact that there is this state-woven story that dominates the media landscape, right? You have every night on CNN, you have people saying and framing the murder of Mike Brown around this supposed crime that he committed, justifying his death, right? So that was a huge part of the storytelling that we were trying to do, which is rather than, and you'll see this if you see the film, there's not a lot of state officials, there's not a lot of police representation, and it's very intentional. And that's not because those interviews don't exist, we did a lot of them, but because we felt that it was important to tell the story from the community-centric standpoint. And as Pamela was saying, it very much is an ensemble cast, right? A lot of people created this moment. It wasn't one dynamic leader that was leading the charge, right? And you'll see that in the film. So when we were making the film, there was a strong leadership around what and care around what that would look like on the ground. It took a long time to get people like Kayla to open up, right? So we would meet night after night in a lot of different situations, whether it was after getting tear gassed or pepper sprayed or simply chased around a neighborhood by the police, or after an organizing meeting, and really want to talk about what that meant. But it took a lot of work and dinners and quiet moments and a lot of the stuff that isn't involved with the camera to get people to open up and really want to talk about those experiences. So yeah, it was definitely a long form process, right? A lot of what makes our filmmaking different than, and people receptive to wanting to open up, was the fact that we weren't parachuting in and out and making extractive filmmaking where, we're trying to take something out of the community and display it for an audience that's exterior to the community. It was really important for us when we were making it to have the community lead the filmmaking, right? So that meant showing cuts to people, that meant having them on the road with us, that meant really involving them in the filmmaking process and getting a lot of dynamic feedback around what we were creating and how we were telling it. So yeah, that was an extremely important piece of what we were doing.
Well, what you touched on is really key in that you all were not parachuting in, you all were not just documenting the uprising as it was happening, you all were right along there with folks in the streets. And one of your co-directors, Damon, is from the area, right? So he knew folks who were in the streets with him. He knew the protagonists of the film, had personal relationships with him, and had to navigate both considering their safety as he was considering his own safety, knowing that he was not going to leave the neighborhood, neither were they, and any portrayal of their actions during those events could possibly negatively affect them. So even though, you were more than just witnesses to these events, you were actors, was there concern about your objectivity in telling this story? If so, where do you hear that concern from? Was that from funders, curators, who may have expressed concern whether or not you all were the best people to tell the story because you were part of it? And then how did your team respond to the suggestion that movements are best told by outsiders?
Yeah, I think bringing in Damon into the process that Sabah and I had started was critically important, and having the voice of St. Louis guide that process was incredibly important. There's definitely pushback in terms of wanting to make it a single character driven piece. There's definitely a lot of resistance around doing that, right? Because there's this push that you should have one leader, right? That you should have one dynamic person is really thrusting the film forward. And that's just not how Ferguson happened. That's not how the movements that we see around the country, they're not happening like that. So it's really important to bring in that more full story that shows Brittany being an activist and creating these moments that lead people into a protest situation, and Kayla organizing on the back end and creating the strategic mission that guides the activism. So it was always very intentional in terms of bringing in that whole story.
I'm curious about how you all navigated this particular issue. As the movement for Black Lives is unfolding, and it's a living movement among young folks across the country. It's sparked organizing around the globe among Black folks throughout the African diaspora. Was there any pressure to not exploit or romanticize what rebellion looks like, but also to show it in all of its complexity? I mean, in some ways, young people who are getting energized right now to join the movement for Black Lives are very proud of their participation in street protests, proud of their newfound consciousness, and proud to say they were on the streets. And these narratives can increase that sense of pride. It can also possibly romanticize what rebellion looks like. And I think what your film does is show that these are hugely traumatic events for the folks in the film. And so how did you balance that desire to both show what urban rebellion looks like and feels like, to give it its respect and due, but not romanticize it for folks?
Right. There's a very big sensitivity around not having it be this sort of action-y film in a lot of the ways that people kind of expect it to be, given the coverage that the national media had around the film, right? So it's really about what that day-to-day organizing looks like, what that building of a community looks like, as opposed to just these visceral moments that you see broadcast, right? That makes it look like the only thing that the rebellion is these explosive moments, when in fact those explosive moments are created out of long form strategizing and philosophy around what are the achievements that we want to create, what are the changes we want to see in local government and state government, and more importantly within the community. How do we galvanize the community to bring about those changes interpersonally? And I think that's where a lot of the things get messy, right? Because you're dealing with real people, you're dealing with real pressures, whether it's finding food or being able to care for your child, while also being involved in a movement that has strong demands from other people in the movement, from the state government putting pressure, from police watching you and following you every night. So there is a lot of that messiness, right? There is a lot of that human character and that human nature of creating change within yourself first before you can change the environment around you. So displaying that truth on camera without compromising or making creating more conflict was incredibly important. And the way that we did that was by, bringing people into the filmmaking process and having them sit with us and talk with us about what their desires were and what their mission was. And especially with Brittany and Kayla, that comes across pretty strongly, because they would really, they really would show us things that maybe we weren't seeing. And could bring some of that perspective of what the community was feeling, what the community desired, and what the community wanted to get out of the film, and how to push that in a way that challenged a lot of the dominant narratives, that challenged the narratives of who this movement, who represented this movement and what it meant. And so that's part of the reason that, besides being dynamic characters in themselves, why Brittany and Kayla lead this film. Because they are the leaders of this movement, right? So you see that in the film.
Thanks, Lucas. When I was working on the Black Panthers Vanguard of the Revolution, there was we were doing a number of screenings around the country, and we were involving Panthers who were both in the film and had been interviewed for the film, and also local Panthers, rank and file Panthers around the country who weren't in the film, but we asked them to participate in Q&As at theatrical screenings or wherever we could take the film to lift up their voices. And what I was noticing in screening after screening is, I would step out into the lobby or into a side room, and I was seeing the Panthers step out as well, time after time, and kind of walking away and going outside for a bit during the film and coming back in. And I would start to ask them what was going on, and it was really clear that it was really difficult to watch the film. That even if they had seen it privately with us before, to see it over and over again, they were seeing shootouts where they had lost friends. They were recalling really moments that were really painful, that they thought that they had dealt with emotionally, but they hadn't really. And seeing it up on screen kind of brought it all back, and they needed to collect themselves before Q&A. So I brought that up earlier, but I wanted to pose this to all of you on the panel. What is your responsibility as filmmakers to prepare the film subjects, these organizers, emotionally for the experience of watching the film over and over again? And what kinds of conversations have you had with them about what they can do to sort of take care of themselves if this is difficult for them? That's for anyone on the panel.
Well, maybe since we have Andrea with us here in the audience, you could speak to that too, right? Or how Andrea prepared us, I should say.
That would be great.
Come on up, come on up. There's a microphone up here.
Hello, good morning. I am really excited to be here, and thanks for the invitation to the Ashland Independent Film Festival. And also thank you, Pam, for putting our story there in a big screen and let us be the voice to tell the story about a collective resistance in Guatemala. Well, answering that, it has been really interesting, the whole process of being filmed and also being shown. It works in double ways. It makes yourself visible, make your job being respected and known for a lot of people inside and outside of Guatemala, which can help a lot with your security, but also vulnerates you in a way that you are in a public opinion and anyone can say anything about you. So it's something that you need to deal with when you are working in media, in human rights, and trying to change something in your society. You became public, you became a part of the public opinion, and you have to learn how to be creative in using those critics and using those awful things that sometimes people can say about your job, especially when you're touching interests of elites that are used to not being judged or just not being questioned about their practices. So you need to be creative at that. And also when you are working in a community organization, you are protected by your community. It's not something about you. It involves your whole community, and that means your family, that means your friends, that means the people that work with you. So even if you are the one that are putting your face in the screen, it's not just your job, it's a collective effort. So that's why it is so effective also to be prepared, not just you and the filmmaker, it is about a collective situation. And for me that has something been really important, because since I met Pam, we became friends before she started shooting what I was doing. So she came to my house, she met my father, my mother, my sisters, my cats. So yeah, for me that was really important, because it meant that she's not interested in just take a story out. She's interested in building relationship, in building community. And that's something that it's really important when you're working in a film project. It's something that also protects you as a filmmaker. Pam has been really heavily accused in Guatemala by the military elite and the economic elite for putting her documentaries out of the world and denouncing the genocide. And they have print a lot of, how do I say, pamphlets?
Pamphlets.
Pamphlets.
Propaganda, pamphlets.
They print propaganda when they put her face and accuse her of terrorism. So that's something that happened in Guatemala from 2012 to today. But we know that if we work together, the work that we do is the one that speaks for us, not answering that people. So that's why it is so important to create a strategy together, to take care of each other and to respect all the job that we're doing, because for our work in human rights in Guatemala, we need to build alliances outside. And these kind of projects like the 500-year documentary can really be helpful to our job, to connect to other people, to travel to Ashland, for example, to meet people that are doing the same, that are resisting a global system that are destroying our lives in the name of progress. So that's why it is so important to work together, to take care of each other, to build strategy. And also, I remember when Pam said, how do you feel about seeing yourself after the world premiere of the documentary? In my personal experience, I had been working in media since I'm 9 years old. And yeah, my father prepared me since I was a kid, and he always said, just be careful of who you listen. If you want to receive good critics, go and hear the people that can help you to grow. Don't listen to bullshit. So that's something that he said since I was a kid, and that guided my life for all this time. I am really careful of the opinions of people that I do care, that can come with really good critics, because they are necessary. And that's something important. Also, I have been seeing the film many, many times, and all the times I take more care and look about a lot of details that I haven't missed, or also recognize stuff in myself or in the other protagonists that I didn't knew. And that is really rich, because you can start actually respecting more the people that you knew before, but there were some details about their personalities, their way of they lived that you didn't notice. And how do you put themselves out as humans with their own contradictions, with their own ways to see the world, with the way we share the view about Guatemala, the ways that we are connected with it. And that for me is really important. It has been really an emotional trip also, because seeing yourself growing up for a while and hearing at your opinions in the past, sometimes mine are more radical now than they used to be in the past. I can confess, because Guatemalan situation from 2012 to today had changed a lot. In the facts of that we didn't believe in 2012 that there was any possibility or any chance that the middle class and the non-indigenous can be starting to take care about the political situation of the country. I was really pessimist about it. I thought that we are going to keep fighting on our own. But now, I feel more optimistic in that, but also more radical, that we need to build political alliances that can lead us to make more dramatic changes that are really important in our country. And the peaceful way, it is important to do it, but sometimes we need to take direct action to force the congressman to do something and change some laws. So that's some stuff that we are planning to do in the future.
Sonya, can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
I mean, for me, the whole reason why I got into film was not to be a filmmaker. I am from this community that I depict, and so the struggles that go on in the film are struggles that go on in my family, that go on in my community. So it's
Right.
very personal, and one of the things that there's a connective tissue, especially between Dolores and 500 years, is I was blown away by 500 years. It just rocked me to the core, and it reminded me why I got into film. And we touch upon it in Dolores as well, in that in many ways the struggle is for memory. And if you look at farm workers, if you look at the face of Cesar Chavez, that brother's a full-blooded Indian. And from the very onset of contact with Europeans when they arrived here, there's been a slow erasure of memory and identity for indigenous people. And then when Africans were brought, it was criminal to have the drum. It was criminal to speak your African language. It was criminal, punishable by death, to identify your tribe, your people. Same thing. It was criminalized for Native people to speak their language, to practice their ceremonies. Up until 1973, some of these things were happening. When you erase a people's memory and identity, it's easy to take their land. It's easy to call them illegal aliens. It's easy to build a wall and put up these borders, which are false. So, to me, the farm worker's struggle and Dolores' struggle, which she inculcated in her children, which my mother inculcated in me, and which the Chicano studies and the Black Panther movement, they were encouraging people and telling people to reclaim that memory, to reclaim that identity, to reclaim that dignity. So this is very personal. And one of the things that I see happening right now with this current administration is a reaction to the activism that was spurned when communities and people started reclaiming identity and memory. It's a reaction to that, because that power was causing massive transformation. And I'm not just talking about communities of color and culture. I'm talking about women reclaiming memory and identity and dignity. And that brought great change, 4 and 5 decades ago. And there's been a concerted effort since that time to roll back and steer the narrative in a different direction. And the struggle in Guatemala, and the struggle in Ferguson, and the struggle that is still happening in the fields, they're all connected. They're all connected. And so in many ways, the struggle really is that reclamation of identity and story. And how do you do that? You have to hear the voices of those community members. So for me, is there a responsibility? There's a tremendous responsibility, but not as a filmmaker. For me, it's as a member of a community. And I think one of the things that we were taught, when you go ask somebody to share something sacred, like their story, their voice, their family story, their history, you gotta go over and knock on their door. You gotta go break bread with them. You gotta make an offering, a gift. We did that with Dolores. We went, and we just didn't go and ask her for her story. It was a family story. Her children, they're the heart and soul of this film. So we went over and we share this. And that trust, that reciprocity is key to telling something that has truth in it, that has soul in it, that has heart, and that people can feel. And I felt that in your film. I was completely rocked by your film. And I was blown away just by some of the themes that were echoed in our film. And even Whose Streets? That film kicked my ass, man. That was an incredible film. And so I see these connective tissues, and one of the things that I see across the board is that the filmmakers see themselves as part of a community. And that first and foremost is what we are held responsible to, not as filmmakers or this is what I do for a living. No, this is my life. You know what I mean? These are my relationships, my relatives, my relations. But I had to say that. I'm getting started, man. I got worked up.
I think that's a great moment, Peter, for us to open up the conversation to the audience and give you all an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists and to chime in a bit. Richard, can you help with this piece, please?
All people. We have a microphone. Kylie, we're just getting it. Okay, sure. Kylie, go around. Anybody raising hands who has a question? Audience? Oh, right over there.
Did you rest? No.
I appreciate this conversation so much, and I've been struggling with some of the issues that you've just addressed. It was a great question about how you make people feel safe and want to be part of the story that you're telling. I'm facing a situation where I'm trying to tell a story of my family and the Holocaust in a country that quite hasn't owned up to their responsibility. And it may be something I can feel a part of it, and I may, sadly it's become a country that I don't speak the language. It moved from Austria-Hungary to Slovakia. And so I could get any kind of person to do translation. But again, there's one survivor that's still in the village of my family. And for her, I know there's resistance in telling this story. I get emotional, I'm so sorry about this, but no matter what angle I would take, it would still feel unsafe, and a story that she does not want to while she's alive, probably to have this story told more. Do you have any advice for someone that wants to make a story about their culture, but in a place that may still be unsafe, and language will be a barrier, and the country that it has become will be a barrier to being identified in this struggle?
Thank you. Great question.
Is it possible? Yeah, is it possible for you to film the story, the complete story, and say that you won't release it until she's ready to release it, or until she passes? At least you will then have recorded the story. And the other thing I would say is I've worked in some places where I don't speak the language, especially in Eastern Congo. It's very important with the translator to even if you don't understand what the person is saying, look them in the eye. nod your head, because you are actually going to be hearing what they're saying, even if you can't hear them, you can't understand them directly. But it's important to make that human contact, so that that the trust begins to be built. Also, sometimes, you know, the negation of something becomes part of the story. Someone not wanting to tell a story is actually an importantly critical element in the telling of a story.
Anyone else want to respond to that question?
This is unorthodox, but from indigenous view. I saw this element in your story as well. Like I said, the story, it's its own entity. It has personhood. It has power. It's a spirit. It's alive. You know, she made her film. I made my film, but it has a power all its own.
That's true.
You watch an audience react to it, you're kind of in awe. Like, oh, what's going on here? Because it has power. So what we try to do is, before we even approach it, everything in this world comes from something in the invisible world. That's where it comes from. So before we even begin, we go over there, and we put an offering down. We ask permission. We acknowledge. It's a part of the reciprocity, and we invite that spirit to come and allow us. That's how we approach it. You know, everyone has their own approach, and I'm not saying that's for everybody, but I'm just saying that's, particularly when you're dealing with trauma of somebody, you know, you're talking about millions of people who were put to death, you know. That's something really, really heavy, and you're asking somebody to share that, and in many cases relive it. So in those times, I feel in particular that's when you want to do that, and I find that when I do that, it opens the gate. Somehow, some way, that it starts coming in through a dream or an idea, or you see something on the street, and that's that language. You pay attention to it, and you.
Yeah, my question is to all of you, but certainly you talked about this, Pamela. When the film production company is, you know, moving forward and doing short docs and follow-up things to continue the energy of what has been presented in the film, and you spoke to this too, Peter, about the energy of it. Are there any actual people designated as part of the production on an ongoing basis to be kind of a pivotal point of organization where the activists, the people involved, et cetera, can have a really ongoing experience over years to connect and input, kind of a, I'm trying to think of a word, you know, just an ongoing critical but very specified, you know, part of the unit or whatever. Because people come out of films that they have a lot of energy and emotion and response and say, you know what, I want to do something now. And they're not sure exactly how to do it on an everyday basis in their city or town or whatever. So to guide that.
Yeah, I think it's important to have a multi-year outreach and impact campaign. I know all the filmmakers here, and Andrea too, agree with that and are beginning to implement that. We have a second editor at Skylight. So Daniel Rivera, he is the one who's always thinking about and responding to activists and putting together the short films that they can use. You know, when you make a long-form documentary, there's a lot of things you film that didn't make it into the film. And the way that you create the narrative arc is very specific. So they can be very important stories and very important people that don't make it into the film. And we want to honor their participation in the film. And we want to make these other things that are used in different ways in the community. So I find it a very welcome trend among documentary filmmakers to know that they have a responsibility with their film as it goes out into the world. Maybe they don't do it themselves. Maybe they work with a team of people or an impact producer to do it. But they're doing it. And now, actually, we're asked, and we ask, what do you want the film to do? You need to think about that while you're making the film, and how do you want the film to go out, and how do you want the film to affect people? And I think that that's really raising the level. I think that's one of the reasons that there's been an explosion in the documentary film genre here in the United States.
Yeah, and I think that process really begins when you're making the film, right? It doesn't start when you finish the cut, right? You don't start to bring in the partners in the film once it's done. You do that throughout the process. And so that dynamic relationship between the film and the people in it is consistent throughout both the making of it, the edit, the rollout, the further impact. So there's never a gap, right? There's never a moment where that story isn't being processed through the community.
Peter, please.
Yeah, I would just say, for me as a filmmaker, there are two things that I hope happen. First of all, this is not the Avengers or Spider-Man, and there's not going to be masses of people. When you have films like this, you have to be on the ground, engaging with audiences, and you don't have the P&A, the marketing, to print ads, full-page ads, and billboards and radio. So you depend a lot on word of mouth. And so if you and the subject of the film and the filmmakers go and engage with audiences, you create a word of mouth campaign, and you reach out when you go to a city to community organizers, teachers, community leaders, and you have to be on the ground engaging with people. And so when, like brother was just saying, when you finish the film, it's just beginning. My first film, I was on the road for 4 years. Wow. Doing distribution, carrying my 35mm prints with me. But I think Angela Davis said something really powerful in our interview. She said, organizing, it doesn't just change laws, it changes emotions, it changes how people feel. So I want audiences, there'll be people who it's gonna change the perception of themselves, it might give them a certain kind of pride or inspiration. That's one kind of response that you want. The other kind of response you want is you want people to get busy and organize. So for that you need somebody like Sonya, who puts social action campaigns together to do outreach, to put curriculum together on how people can take action. I mean, because they have all this energy, but they need it's a call to action in many ways, but so you need some kind of a strategic plan that they can follow through. And I think a lot of films are doing that today, and distributors are recognizing that, and that helps generate audiences for films. And that's becoming like par for the course almost, I would say.
So we have time for just one more question over here.
And that wonderful answer was part of what I'd like to ask about. As a civil rights, voting rights volunteer in Alabama in the 60s who was deeply affected by Bob Moses and Ella Baker and their theory of organizing, and as somebody who loved Stanley Nelson's film, which is about, among other things, how the FBI managed to prospectively kill off black leadership. But my question is, so when we had this election, the first thing I wanted to do was to read about the resistance in Germany and look at what people learned from how they did that. What were the similarities? What were the differences? What could be learned? And so certainly in the last 6 months, I think most of us would say that nobody had any idea that we had hopes that this level of resistance would arise, and it certainly has a future. So my question is really the connection between the organizing and the films that you do. How do you see, you mentioned her work about these impact, but how do you see these films building the sense of possibility, changing those emotions inside people so that they come forward?
Anyone on the panel want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. I mean, I think something that was really important for us was having people see themselves in the film, right? Having people be able to see this story as not being written for someone else, but being written for them. And that in itself brings that power and that courage to the table. When you see that, when you see someone that's like you on the screen telling a story that you've experienced in some shape or form, you can build that energy, and you can feel in community with the film and the people that are there and the people in your community that you want to inspire to also lead the change in your own community.
I think one of the things that became apparent for us was that Dolores Huerta, she lives at the intersection of several movements. She started off as, you know, a labor organizer, but it soon became a struggle for racial justice. And then it soon became a feminist struggle. And so I think organizing and activism in general is moving away from silo organizing, and so there really is a kind of intersectional activism that's happening, and I really feel it's crucial at this point to help people see the linkages between all the different issues. They're all related. I mean, the Republican administration right now, Trump, they know that. They've been knowing that shit.
That's why they attack everyone.
But we need to see that they are connected and that we are all connected. You know, that your struggle is my struggle. And so I feel like that's one of the crucial messages that has to be, you know, shared with people. And then the other thing is, one thing that wasn't around 50 years ago, I mean, marketing and consumption is just, it's on the highest level. And with the social media, I mean, social media has become an asset for organizing, but it's also, I mean, as a parent, it's affecting my children and my nieces and nephews and young people in my community in ways that I'm not really in line with. So you're fighting this consumption marketing thing, and I think activism can sometimes be channeled. So like Sonya mentioned earlier, yeah, I went and marched, you know, and then posted on my Facebook, and people are doing these things to like have a cool post. So in order to help move us, you know, past that, there's a little bit of a disillusionment with organizing and activism. People, especially after the election, like, fuck it, you know, what's the use? I mean, I don't matter. But I know that one thing that we want to bottle and channel is like people are coming out and saying, holy shit, this woman, or like this struggle has been going on for 500 years. You know, what's going on in Ferguson, the indigenous struggle in North Dakota, the tar sands in Guatemala, this is a long ass struggle. And we're in it for generations. And I think that's what needs to be, you know, inculcated and shared, especially with young people, because young people, they have this energy, but they need to be kind of reminded that it's not instant, it's not FedEx, it's not overnight. You know, you can't Twitter it and then post it and that's my contribution. It's, you know, to share that it's for the long haul, and there's beauty in that longevity, you know.
Courage breeds courage. And these stories are really not about the plight, well, although that's part of it, but it's really about the fight. And the fight, we want to take the fight out. We want people to be inspired by the stories, and we want people to be inspired by the courage. And we want them to feel like, I can do this. I'm part of this.
And you get to hang out with folks like this.
No, I wanted to say that also, looking at what is going on now in USA, it's like, it is going to be interesting times for you, like to take people out of their comfort zone, because a lot of people take their human rights, their civil rights for granted. And as Angela Davis says, freedom is a constant struggle. It's something that you have to do daily. And that's the challenge. And that's something that we have learned for a long time in indigenous communities, to resist, to persist, to organize, to mobilize, and to keep repeating it. And never forget about it. So we do not take the good things that had happened for granted. We keep conquering our rights and also seeing in future. Because sometimes we are used to these revolutionary moments that change one moment in history that is great and you're part of it, but we need to look forward. We need to look for the future of the planet of the whole species that lives in the planet, because what world are we going to leave to the kids? Okay, let's fight for freedom of expression, for human rights, but yeah, the world is getting polluted, so they're going to live with freedom of expression without water. So what sense does make? So that's why it's so important also to call action, not just inside political movements, but also reflection of the way you live your own life, the way you use your resources, to build this coherence that is really hard, but it is possible, you know, to be aware of the part of the community you live, like organize yourself in with your neighbors, you know, something that we have lost a lot, especially in big cities. People doesn't know each other. You don't know who is your next doors. So that's something that you need to recover. We need to keep building community. Building communities will help us to survive this Holocaust. Because what the economic power is doing to all of us is an Holocaust. It's a slow Holocaust. And that's why we need to resist together. And for us in Guatemala, we have been living with Trumps for 30 years. Yeah, and it's hard, let me tell you that. But it is possible, you can survive, you will survive, you have to resist, you have to organize, and you will win at the end.
Sonya, any last words?
Yeah, I would just say, all of these films really force all of us to bear witness to a people, to struggle, but also to victory. And by making these films, you all have forced us to bear witness, but also ensured that we weave these films and these stories into the historical memory so that they cannot be erased. Even if someone tries to defund PBS, these stories will live and move in communities and they cannot be erased. And we all will be forced to reckon with the reality of them. I think what these films do extremely well is to not just ask us to empathize with the people on the front lines of these struggles, but to see ourselves in them. These are enormously powerful tools to build solidarity. For us to see ourselves in these movements, in these communities, and to not donate or give money or support from afar, but to activate something in ourselves personally and to find ways that we can be active in our own communities. So I want to thank Andrea for joining the conversation. I want to thank you, Peter, Pam, and Lucas, for giving us your heartfelt work, for contributing to this dialogue, and most of all, for giving us these beautiful and powerful narratives, which we need so much. So I thank you all.